Many factors contributed to the growth of American industry: abundant raw materials, a large and growing labor supply, a surge in technological innovation, the emergence of a talented, ambitious, and often ruthless group of entrepreneurs, a federal government eager to assist the growth of business, and a great and expanding domestic market for the products of manufacturing. Because the United States economy relied so heavily on the railroad and urban construction, the most important technological advancement was the revolutionizing of the iron and steel industries. New techniques discovered by Henry Bessemer, William Kelly, and Abram S. Hewitt made possible the production of steel in great quantities and for steel to be used in manufacturing locomotives, steel rails, and girders for tall buildings. The steel industry first emerged in western Pennsylvania and Ohio because of a plentiful supply of iron ore and an already flourishing iron industry, and Pennsylvania's abundance of hard coal used for fuel. As a result, Pittsburgh became the center of the steel industry. The steel industry caused the rise of the petroleum industry because of the steel industry's need for lubrication for its machines. In the 1850s, George Bissell proved that oil could be burned in lamps and produce paraffin and lubricating oil. The creation of gasoline and the internal combustion engine led to the invention of the automobile. Designers in Europe, mainly France, Germany, and Austria, developed the internal combustion engine that was inspired by the success of the railroads. Nicholas August Otto, a German, developed a gas-powered engine in the 1860s. Then Gottfried Daimler perfected an engine that could be used in automobiles. After these major breakthroughs, Americans quickly developed engines of their own. In 1893, Charles and Frank Duryea made the first motor vehicle to run on gasoline. In 1896, Henry Ford built the first car that would eventually bear his name and become famous. By 1917, there were 5 million automobiles on American highways.
Okay.
Beginning in the late 19th century, scientists and engineers in the United States and Europe began to experiment with ways to attain human flight, including balloons, gliders, and kites. Two brothers in Ohio, Wilbur and Orville Wright, were experimenting with gliders. They successfully built a glider that could be propelled through the air by an internal combustion engine. By the end of 1904, they had improved the airplane to fly over 23 miles, and soon they were taking passengers up into the air. Despite the first working airplane being invented in America, aviation technology did not gain much more popularity in the United States. The U.S. government created the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics in 1915, and American airplanes made an appearance in World War I, but most advancements happened in France. The rapid development of the new industrial technologies encouraged business leaders to sponsor their own research to allow them to keep up with the rapid changes in industry. Companies including Bell Telephone, DuPont, General Electric, Eastman Kodak, and others were spending thousands of dollars each year for research by their own company engineers and scientists. Corporate research gained popularity at the same time government-funded research declined. This meant that corporations could hire skilled researchers that had previously been employed by the government. This also meant that research would move along multiple independent paths from the government. Engineers began to perform practical research instead of basic research, which scientists claimed was more important. Even so, scientists did join with engineers in corporate laboratories that performed practical and basic research. University-based research became tied to the needs of the economy also. A partnership between corporations and universities developed in which university and faculty laboratories would receive corporate funding. Industrialists started to turn to Frederick Winslow Taylor's new principles of scientific management, also known as Taylorism. Taylor encouraged a reorganization of the production process by subdividing tasks. This would speed up production, make workers interchangeable, and reduce the need for skilled workers. Scientific management was also a way to increase the employer's control of the workplace and to make working people less independent. An important change in the industrial era was mass production, and in particular the moving assembly line. Henry Ford introduced this revolutionary technology in his automobile plants in 1914. Although there were many other technological advancements in the late 19th century, the main aspect of progress remained the railroad. It was the United States' main form of transportation and determined where the agricultural and industrial economy developed. Wherever railroad lines went, people and work followed. The railroad lines were also the reason for time zones. Because the nation had no concept of standard time, the railroad schedules were difficult to follow. But in 1883, the railroad companies worked together to decide on 4 time zones across the U.S. that were an hour apart from its adjacent zone. Railroad trackage increased dramatically. By 1900, there were 193,000 miles of track across the United States. Railroad combinations were emerging as the first forms of corporations. They relied on subsidies from federal or state governments to finance their rapid expansion. The modern corporation was a result of industrialists realizing they could not finance bigger projects by themselves. By selling stocks to the public, businesses were able to gather large amounts of money to finance projects. Limited liability made the buyers of these stocks more likely to invest because they were only responsible for their investment, not the company's debts. The railroad industry was among the first to adopt this new form of corporation, but soon it spread to the steel industry. Andrew Carnegie dominated the industry by buying up companies that could not compete with him, railroads and coal mines. This meant that he controlled the processing of his steel from mine to market. New managing techniques, including the middleman, made consolidation possible. Consolidation was a way to create a large company and eliminate competitors. Horizontal integration was combining multiple firms engaged in the same type of business into one large corporation. Vertical integration was buying up businesses that a company relied on for its primary function, like Carnegie Steel. The most well-known and celebrated corporation of this time was John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil, which grew using horizontal and vertical integration. Rockefeller was known as one of the wealthiest men of the time and one of the most powerful monopolies. Trusts were another form of consolidation and organization. Under a trust agreement, stockholders in individual corporations transferred their stocks to a small group of trustees in exchange for shares in the trust itself. This allowed the trustees to have control over multiple companies, even if they might only own a few. In 1889, New Jersey made buying up other companies legal, and other states soon followed. This produced a third form of consolidation, holding companies. A holding company was when a central corporate body bought up stocks and had formal ownership of the corporations in the trust.
Capitalism created great economic growth by integrating operations, cutting costs, creating a great industrial infrastructure, stimulating new markets, creating jobs for a vast new pool of unskilled workers, and opening the way to a large-scale mass production. Despite these economic advancements, farmers saw capitalism as a threat to the Republican society, where wealth is widely distributed, and the middle class pointed to industrialists producing corruption in a local, state, and national politics.
There were some millionaires who claimed to have been self-made. For example, men like Andrew Carnegie, John Rockefeller, and E.H. Harriman all started with plain jobs and progressed to be very successful. Because of their money, they acted ruthless, arrogant, and corrupt, thinking that they don't have to abide by the government rules. But the average industrialist was in fact failing and falling under monopolistic control. Most wealthy people believed that because they are worthy, they became rich, and that poor people were less fortunate because of their laziness, stupidity, and carelessness. This belief was strengthened by social Darwinism, the survival of the fittest. Herbert Spencer and William Sumner were supporters of these ideas, except Sumner disagreed with some points and believed that individuals should be free to struggle, which was supported by industrialists. Philanthropy has evolved with meaning over time, which went from gracious giving to huge amounts of giving by the wealthy. Andrew Carnegie and Warren Buffett were philanthropists. Social Darwinism appealed to businessmen because it confirmed their success and virtues, it placed their activities within the context of American traditions and freedom, and it justified their tactics.
The gospel of wealth was an idea that stated rich people should use their wealth to advance progress. Andrew Carnegie wrote a book with the same name as the idea. The book stated the ideas that the wealthy should use their money to contribute to the community.
Alger wrote many novels based on the ideas of rag to riches, which his novels sold over 20 million copies. His novels reinforced the idea of the self-made man and the idea if someone worked hard, they could be successful. This idea became the idea of the American.
Alternate visions. Many authors disapproved of the capitalist system. One example was Lester Frank Ward. In his novel Dynamic Society, he urged against the ideas of social Darwinism and civilization was shaped by intelligence. Other Americans who distrusted the capitalist system formed the Socialist Labor Party. Led by Daniel de Leon, the party gained a large following but not large enough to hold major political power.
Which wrote Progress and Poverty, which explained that the wealthy class were able to build great fortunes due to the wealth, while the poor could not. Another popular novel was Edward Bell Amy's utopian novel, where a young American from 1887 awoke in 2000, where a large trust controlled the government and shared the wealth equally.
A movement against monopolies began to form among laborers, farmers, and consumers. They blamed monopolies, especially for high prices, on select railroads due to no competition. Monopolies were also blamed for the fluctuating economy in the late 19th century. Other reasons people disliked monopolies included the threat to individuality, the unequal wealth, and 1% of Americans owned about 88% of the wealth, and 10 million people lived below the poverty line. Louisa May Alcott wanted to write novels about realistic women. She wrote the novel Little Women. She wrote outside the norm for the time, and her novels are still popular today.
The immigrant workforce. As farmers left rural areas to move to the cities, about 25 million immigrants arrived in the U.S. between 1865 and 1915. At first, the majority of immigrants came from North Europe, but later large numbers of Eastern and Southern Europeans migrated to eastern cities, while in the West, large number of immigrants came from China and Mexico. Immigrants were often lured to work for low-paying jobs. These jobs were often unfair, usually favoring Northern Europeans, thus paying more compared to Southern Europeans, which led to bitter differences between the groups.
Most American workers were poor. The average yearly wage was about $400 to $500, compared to a yearly wage of $600, which allowed someone to live with basic comfort. Workers had little job security due to the boom and bust economy. Previous laborers faced hardships adapting to factory work. Some issues included long work days, bad conditions, frequent work-related accidents, and loss of control.
In the early 1900s, women made up over 17% of the industrial workforce, and 20% of women earned wages. Many married women worked because two incomes allowed families to live in basic comforts. Women's wages were usually less than half of male workers' wages. In the 1900s, an average male worker's wage was $597, while female workers' wages were $314. 1.7 million children under the age of 16 were employed due to families needing more wages. Child labor laws were passed in many states, but were rarely enforced. Many children died or were injured in industrial accidents.
Labor unions were ways workers could fight against the cruel conditions of factory life. Leaders of labor unions at this time hoped to combine other unions. The first large labor union was the National Labor Union, founded in 1866, with over 640,000 members. This union disbanded after the economic panic of 1873. The Molly Maguires was a radical labor union that often used violence and murder.
Knights of Labor, founded in 1869, allowed most workers, including women. This union was organized and fought for shorter workdays and the end of child labor and a cooperative system that allowed workers to control the economy. The union disappeared after a failed strike against the Texas and Pacific Railroads. The American Federation of Labor, founded in 1881, was a union of skilled labor workers and opposed female workers. They fought for better working conditions, fought for a national 8-hour workdays, and in 1886, during a strike, a bombing happened and it killed 7 people and injured 67 others. This bombing became a symbol of violence of labor unions, which many failed to recover.
Great Railroad Strike. In 1877, Eastern Railroad companies announced a 10% wage cut. This led to strikes all over the Northeast. Federal troops were sent to West Virginia and over 100 people died, and the strike ended several weeks after it started. This was the first major labor conflict in America.
Homestead strike resulted when new production methods were added to steel production and reduced the company's dependence on skilled workers. One of the factories of the Carnegie system had workers under the Amalgamation Association of Iron and Steel Workers, and this factory needed to be let go. The workers faced constant wage cut after another. The announcement of another wage cut, the workers went on strike and the plant was shut down. The strike was successful for a while, but the governor sent National Guards to the Union to surrender after a radical tried to assassinate a powerful figure in the factory.
Pullman strike. The Pullman Company outside Chicago announced a 25% wage cut. Workers went on strike and persuaded the American Railway Union not to carry Pullman's cars. This led to many railroad workers going on strike, and transportation from Chicago to the Pacific was halted. The governor of Illinois refused to take action, which resulted in railroad operators asking the federal government instead, which Grover Cleveland sent 2,000 troops and ended the strike.
Cases labor unions faced included labor unions only represented a small amount of the workforce, excluded certain groups, the constant moving of workers, and people could move up the job ladder. And the most important was a corporate strength that limited labor union power.